Okay, welcome to the Wednesday at NICO seminar. Today we are very lucky to have Raissa D'Souza as our speaker. I'll try to keep this short, even though there is so much to say. Raissa is visiting us from University of California at Davis. She is a professor of computer science and mechanical engineering there, but also associate dean of engineering. And she's also affiliated with the Santa Fe Institute and the Complexity Hub in Vienna, which I see as the European Santa Fe Institute. Maybe I shouldn't say that, but I think those are both excellent places. And also affiliated with exactly the NICO of the West and the NICO of the East across the ocean. And associated with physics and applied math as well. She does so many things. I think complexity is a good description for what she does to sum all of that up. She's been the former president of the Network Science Society and also won the Euler Award from the Network Science Society. She's a fellow of the American Physical Society, lead editor of Physical Review Research, great journal, which has taken off, I think, thanks to her editorship. And also an editor at Science. She's published in all the big name journals. Her work is on networks, percolation, synchronization, core material that should be of interest to almost everyone affiliated with NICO. But with applications also widespread to travel, to MEMS and NEMS devices, to the power grid. Her work is just, I think, can be summed up as super interesting and connected to everything. So join me in welcoming Raissa. Welcome.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for that amazing introduction. And it's always really great to be here at NICO. I have so many long-term friends here and have always been visiting NICO since basically it started. And I'm always amazed at how much interest and support there is for NICO. So it's such a unique place. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about thinking about complex networks, which is something that I've been studying for quite some time, and how we can also think about networks with complicated nodes. So one thing that I think about quite a lot, and I think a lot of people in this audience too, is that the modern world is made up of a system of interconnected networks. So we have things like a virus that mutates on a biological network, and that virus spreads over a social contact network. And those social contact networks are embedded by long-range links from transportation networks that rely on electricity and telecom networks, and also on information and communication networks. So we need all these networks to interact seamlessly to give us the types of functions that we rely on as a modern society. And one of the challenges is that each network on its own can be a complex system. So what does it mean to be a complex system? My definition of a complex system is that it's a system with emergent behaviors. So what are emergent collective behaviors? These are behaviors that we would not have predicted a priori, knowing all the constituent equations of motion of the individual elements. There are things that we can observe and then try and understand the mechanisms that gave rise to them. So I'm thinking of things like synchronization, where local interactions give rise to large-scale structure, pattern formation, something I study extensively, which is phase transitions, and also cascading failures, which is a hallmark of complex systems. So once we observe these emergent behaviors, we can often understand the underlying mechanisms that gave rise to them, but we wouldn't have predicted them a priori. So my background is grounded in statistical physics, and statistical physics has given us a tremendous lever to understand complex networks. So what is a network from a statistical physics approach? We're going to start from a random graph. So this is a graph where we have specified something macroscopic about the system, and we want to think about the microscopic configurations that are consistent with that macroscopic description. So one of the main things that we look at is the degree distribution of a network. So the x-axis is the degree. So how many edges does a node have? How many partners does it have? So it's the x-axis. And the y-axis is the fraction of nodes in the network that specific degree. So specifying the degree distribution, I can make a configuration that has that macroscopic degree distribution. If the degree distribution has this nice power law behavior that I've illustrated here, it's what we call a scale-free network. So the degree distribution is a power law. We haven't said anything else about the other structures that are present, but this is our starting point. And what we do is we calculate the probabilistic properties of the ensemble of all graphs that are consistent with that macroscopic descriptor. So standard approach from statistical physics. So how do we calculate the properties of this ensemble of random graphs? So there's two approaches that partner together. So we think about something called the configuration model. So I have this macroscopic property that I want to satisfy. So I'm going to start out with a collection of nodes and stubs. So they haven't yet been partnered, but each node has a stub specifying what its n degree should be, drawn from an example of this macroscopic degree distribution. And then I do a random matching and I match all of the stubs and I end up with an instance of a graph that's consistent with this macroscopic description. To calculate the ensemble properties, we turn to something called generating functions, where I think about the probabilistic aspects of how the macroscopic properties are related to microscopic details. So I can think about following an edge into somewhere in the network. I might have reached an isolated node. I might have reached a node that has excess degree 1, a node that has excess degree 2, et cetera, et cetera. And from that, I can calculate the expected properties of this random graph. For instance, what I've shown you here is the celebrated formula, which tells me the criteria for the emergence of large-scale connectivity. So the emergence of a giant component in a random graph when we first see macroscopic levels of connectivity. And so the generating function and configuration model let us understand lots of aspects about this ensemble of random graphs. One caveat I should mention that you probably can see from this picture already is that this approach requires that my network be locally tree-like. So I can't have any loops in my network. So certainly that is not consistent with a lot of feedback that we see in real world systems, but we've made tremendous progress from this approach. Another approach is that we can use kinetic theory or rate equations. So we think about the evolution of some macroscopic aspect of the graph as a function of time. So the graph at the next time step is a function of the graph at the current time. What I've drawn here is the equation that describes preferential attachment. So we think about nodes arriving and connecting into an existing network, and they connect with probability that's proportional to the current degree. And we can analyze these rate equations and understand asymptotic properties. So we can understand the limit when the network size goes to infinity. And if we're looking at a dynamic system, we look at the steady state when time essentially goes to infinity. So with these random graphs, we've been able to understand quite a lot about networks. So we've been having tremendous results that tell us about the vulnerability and resilience of networks to node and edge removal. So if we have a power law degree distribution, the network is very robust to removal of random edges. It stays together. Removal of random nodes, it stays together, but it's very fragile to targeted removal of nodes. So if I remove the top high degree nodes from the network breaks into pieces. We've also been able to understand a lot about epidemic spreading. When there is an emergence of a giant component, we can have the outbreak of a pandemic, for instance. And one of the very surprising results that we've gotten from these random graphs is that the epidemic threshold can actually approach 0. So you need a infinitely small number of initial nodes to be infected for a disease to take over the whole network. There's been a lot of work about percolation and extent of connectivity, critical thresholds for cascading behaviors, understanding of diffusion and spreading processes on networks, opinion dynamics, voter models, et cetera. So this approach has let us understand a lot of things about networks, but I want to remind you that we're only able to get real results for the thermodynamic limit when the network is infinite in size, and certainly no physical network can be truly infinite in size If we think about social networks, we're limited to billions of nodes because that's the number of people on the planet, and that's not in the n goes to infinity regime. We also can only analyze equilibrium or steady state behavior, and we're thinking again about the ensemble calculations. So we typically think about having very simple nodes and edges. The node is on or off, it's healthy or infected. And we think about the complexity lying in the topology, the way that the nodes connect to one another. So we see things like the broad scale degree distributions, like the power law degree distribution. We see a lot of triangular closure or clustering, small world properties, and modularity or community structure. So this underlying non-trivial topology gives rise to a lot of the emergent properties that I showed you on the last page. So we can ask ourselves, where's the origin of these emergent collective behaviors that we want to understand? Is it in the network structure? Is it in the nodal dynamics themselves? So the nodes can have very complicated nonlinear internal dynamics, or is it in both? And in real world systems, we tend to see that it's in both. But when we look at the x-axis and we think about network complexity, that's the realm of statistical physics, where I just showed you the configuration model, the generating function, and the amazing results that we get from thinking about very simple nodes, which have very highly non-trivial connectivity patterns. When we go out on the on the x-axis, we're thinking about increasing the node complexity. So instead of having very simple nodes, the nodes can have very complicated nonlinear internal dynamics. But in order to analyze those systems, we normally have to have very simple network structures. We think about complete graphs, we think about stars, we think about rings. And that's the realm of nonlinear dynamics and control theory, is thinking about complicated nodes with simple network structures. And certainly things like brains, power grids, financial networks, human societies have both complicated nodal dynamics and non-trivial network structures. So how are we going to be able to bring these two fields together to understand real world systems? So a lot of my thinking in this realm was shaped by a wonderful project that we had going on for 6 years, thanks to the Army Research Office, a MURI grant for controlling collective phenomena and complex networks. And that helped shape my thinking. But for the last several years, I want to acknowledge my collaborators, Mario Di Bernardo and Yangyu Liu. We've together been organizing several satellite meetings to think about control of complex networks. And we've been working together to understand how we can make this partnership between statistical physics, nonlinear dynamics, and control theory. So together, we just wrote a perspective piece that came out in Nature Reviews Physics in March of this year, where we're trying to think about how we can bring all of these principles together and think about controlling complicated networks with complicated nodes. So complex networks with complex nodes. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about this work today and give you a bit of an overview. So today's agenda is going to be thinking about having complex topologies and complex nodal dynamics. And the first thing I want to talk to you about is the emergent interactions that happen when we allow complexity in both sides of the system. So we're going to talk a little bit about decoupled states, and then I'm going to talk to you about a classic model of cascading failures, the BTW sandpile model, and what happens when we couple that with the classic model of synchronization of the Kuramoto model, and a little bit about self-organized criticality and Dragon Kings. And then in the last third of my talk, I'm going to turn to thinking about how we can control these networks. We're certainly at a point in time where we've got a lot of insight into networks and their behaviors. So now we are in position that we can start thinking about control interventions and how we might manipulate small scale degrees of freedom to enact the large scale macroscopic behaviors that we want. So let's start out thinking about the emergent interactions when we have complex nodes and complex networks. So this is going to be work that starts in the lab of Michael Rokas and Matt Matheny at Caltech. And Matt and Michael study NEMs. So they look at nano electromechanical devices that are microscopic, nanoscale. And this is a picture of one of their devices, and it's a membrane that oscillates. So you push on the membrane and you look at the amplitude oscillations. And this particular device has a nonlinear response. So this is the frequency with which I'm exciting the oscillator, and this is the amplitude response. And it has what's called a Duffing nonlinearity, a classic Duffing nonlinearity. And the amplitude of the oscillator, so this membrane oscillates very rapidly in time, which is these blue lines, but it has a slowly varying envelope that's shown by the black and the red lines, which are real and imaginary parts. So we're going to be looking at the envelope equations. So each oscillator, I, has a slow time envelope dynamics, A sub I of t. So we are going to use a simple ring structure here to couple them. So we're thinking about the nodes being coupled in a ring structure. So the evolution in time of that slowly varying envelope has a dissipation term, it has that Duffing nonlinearity, it has some self-feedback, and then coupling, because each oscillator is coupled to its neighbor to the right and its neighbor to the left. So when we analyze this equation, if we have a ring that is a multiple of 4, so a very specific system, so any ring that's a multiple of 4, we see that the interplay of the nodal dynamics and the coupling structure leads to what's called decoupled states. So we see that the physically coupled neighbors end up acting independently of one another. Their phases are independent, but the next nearest neighbors that are shown here in the same color end up being phase locked at exactly 180 degrees different. So the physical couplings don't play a role in the observed dynamics, and we see emergent second order nearest neighbor coupling. And I think I have a movie here. Let's see if it's going to play. So you can see the dynamics where we started the oscillators at random phases. And you'll see that as the time evolves, we get these two clusters that end up decoupled from one another. And again, the physical coupling is between nearest neighbors, but those nearest neighbors act independently of one another. And we see phase locking emergent between next nearest neighbors. So we call this a decoupled state. And we can see emergent couplings of higher order as well that supersede the physical coupling. So this was work that appeared in 2019. And if we look at the linear stability calculations to tell us about whether those states are stable or not, I want to call out Jeff Emmenheiser, who was a PhD student at that time in our research group, and he did these linear stability calculations. And as long as we have a ring that's a multiple of 4, we find that the Jacobian that describes the linear stability breaks up into 4x4 blocks. Each block has this structure right here, and we can analytically solve the linear stability equations. And we find something very interesting. So the average amplitude of our oscillators is 1, but we need the phase amplitude interactions in order for the state to be stable. So if we have phase only oscillators, the state is not stable. We need the amplitude fluctuations to play a role to stabilize the system. What role these amplitude fluctuations play is an unknown question that we haven't figured out, but we can analytically show that without those amplitude fluctuations, the state is unstable and it wouldn't persist. So we'd never see these decoupled states in phase-only oscillators. When we looked more generally at decoupled states in networks and arbitrary networks, I want to point out Anastasia Salva at the back row there, who was integral to understanding how to generalize decoupled states into more arbitrary network structures and arbitrary nodal dynamics. So pretty much tour de force work that Anastasia led, looking at how we can see splay states and more intricate behaviors that arise from the interactions of the nodal dynamics and the network structure themselves, where the dynamics that we observe ends up not showing the physical connectivity, but has higher order emergent connections. Excuse me. But I want to talk to you about how we can start thinking about partnering these complicated nodes, complex networks. And one thing that we can do is we can start thinking about increasing the network complexity. So what is a network? A network is an edge list. So it's looking at who is partnered to whom. So I can write a list of dyadic interactions, of two-way interactions, but sometimes that's not enough. So we can think about something like a chemical reaction. Sometimes you need 3 species to be present in order for something to happen. And if only 2 of those species are there, nothing happens. For instance, we might think about this plaquette here, A3, A2, and A8. All 3 of them need to be present in order for a chemical reaction to proceed. If 2 are there, nothing happens. We can also think about co-authorship networks of authors writing papers together. They form these groups that are not described by binary interactions. So we are very interested in increasing network complexity to this hypergraph level. And one of the challenges is that hyper edges of all orders contribute to the dynamical evolution of the system and to the linear stability equations. And this is work that Anastasia also led and showed us how we can use adjacency matrices in order to break the dynamics down into nodes that have similar dynamics and edges that have similar, that connect nodes with similar dynamics. So we can look at the node clusters shown here by different colors on the y-axis, and edge clusters shown as different colors on the dynamics up here, the x-axis up here. And by looking at these node clusters and edge clusters, we're able to identify a set of matrices that need to be simultaneously block diagonalized in order to simplify the structure of the Jacobian and enable us to do linear stability calculations. But I want to bring in the nodal dynamics as well. So we want to increase network structure complexity. We also want to think about how these nodes and edges and the network structure and nodal dynamics give rise to new kinds of properties. And in particular, we were really interested in what is the role of nodal dynamics in cascading failures. So I'm going to tell you about something called the BTW sandpile model next. And it's a model that's been used to describe cascading failures very broadly, including in things like power grids and brain networks. It neglects the underlying oscillatory dynamics of the nodes, and we want to understand what happens when we bring that into the picture. But to start at the very basic part, we'll think about very simple nodes. So the Bach-10 Weisenfeld sandpile model is a paper that was introduced in PhysRev Letters in 1987 and has become a very seminal model about cascading failures. So what we're going to think about is a network context. So we have a network drawn here, and at each discrete time step, a unit of load or a grain of sand is going to fall at a node chosen arbitrarily, uniformly at random. And each node has the ability to hold some amount of sand, but once its amount of sand that it holds is equal to its degree, the node is unstable and it topples, and it sheds all of that sand to all of its neighbors. So for instance, if the grain of sand had just fallen on this node here, shown in red, which now has degree 4, that grain is going to shed sand to all of its neighbors. So now neighbor here is unstable and is going to topple, and this neighbor is unstable, is going to topple, which can cause further topplings and further topplings and further topplings. And what Bach-10 Weisenfeld showed us that the probability of S nodes toppling is a power law that goes as S to the -3/2. And one thing I should mention is that every time sand is shed, there is a small dissipation probability epsilon. And so this robust behavior has been observed in so many different instances that people have used this Bach-10 Weisenfeld model to characterize electrical blackouts, fluctuations in financial markets, firing of neurons in our brains, sizes of earthquakes, forest fires, et cetera, et cetera. And so these power law distributions in cascade size have been somewhat universal. And I want to point out, and I'll come back to this a little bit later, but those extreme events in power law distributions are often referred to as black swans. So they are generated by the same mechanism that gave rise to the smaller events, but they're very rare events. So why do we see SOC? The classic explanation is that it is self-organization around an absorbing state phase transition. So a phase transition is when we see an abrupt change in the order parameter of a system with response to a small change in an external control parameter. So what I've drawn here is actually looking at the largest size of a connected component in a network as a function of the expected number of partners that each node has. So as I start increasing along the x-axis, the degree of each node is increasing, and I want to understand what fraction of nodes are in the largest component. And this is a classic example of the Erdős-Rényi phase transition, where below a certain level of connectivity, the largest component is logarithmic in the size of the system. Above the phase transition, it's linear. So we see the emergence of a giant component. That's an example of a phase transition. So self-organized criticality is a result of two forces in tension. So we have driving, the sand is arriving, the load is arriving on the system. So it's increasing the energy of the system. And every time that a cascade happens, there's dissipation between when the sand is being shed, there's some probability of it dissipating. So the tension between driving and dissipation balances the system right at the critical point, and a signature of being at the critical point is we see power law distributions and response functions. So this is a classic explanation of SOC. It's self-organization around a second order phase transition. So how do we see SOC in power grids in the brain when it neglects the oscillatory nature of the nodes? So with Goran Mikaberedze, who's a current PhD student in my group, we wanted to ask this question: what happens when we bring oscillatory dynamics into the system as well? So our initial goal was to leverage the interaction between oscillations and cascading failures to minimize large cascades. And we were motivated by things like the power grid, where we really don't want to have any kind of large scale failures. So this is work that appeared in Chaos last year. So what we did for the oscillators is we said, let's turn to the classic model of oscillator synchronization, the Koromoto model. So each oscillator has a phase that evolves in time, and it's a function of its natural frequency and its coupling to its neighbors. So the neighbors that it's connected to want to align in phase. And there's a coupling parameter K, which is the strength of the interactions between neighbors. And what Koromoto showed us is that there is a critical coupling strength. So if we look at the infinite size network, there's a critical coupling strength below which we never see the network synchronize, above which we see synchronization that rapidly grows to have full synchronization in the system. So we use the Koromoto model as the underlying dynamics for the oscillator, for the nodal oscillations. So each node in our network now has 3 degrees of freedom. It has its phase from the Koromoto model, it has its capacity to hold sand, and it has the current level of sand that it's holding, its load. So each node has these 3 degrees of freedom, its phase, its capacity, and its load. So our motivation was from the power grids. And what we know on the grids is that when generators are out of phase with their neighbors, they're more vulnerable and likely to fail. So we wanted to capture that aspect. So this is what we did. We coupled the BTW model and the Koromoto model. So we said that if a node topples during a cascade, its phase in the Koromoto layer is randomly reset at the end of the cascade. And the BTW model, as you see, is a discrete dynamics. A grain of sand falls, a bunch of stuff happens, power law distribution and the number of nodes that topple, and then we drop the next grain of sand. So we think about the sand falling, the driving rate is infinitely slow, essentially. And now we want to think about coupling the Koromoto model and the BTW model. So if a node is out of sync with its neighbors, it's more vulnerable, so we're going to lower its capacity. And what this does is it creates endogenous cascade seeds. So in the original model, a cascade could only happen when an external grain of sand fell into the system. Now cascades can happen because a node's threshold is lowered because it's out of phase with its neighbor, and it's going to topple and cause these endogenous seeds. And the Koromoto model is a continuous time dynamics. So we have to think about how to couple the discrete dynamics and the continuous time dynamics and think about some separation of timescales. We're going to stick with BTW's idea that the cascade dynamics are instantaneous And they happen very rapidly when compared to the Komodo model timescales. So what we see are emergent periodic oscillations. We put this model on 3 regular random graphs to start. So Luis, please.
More detail, just to make sure that I understand the model. So you drop a grain of sand, and let's imagine that that gives rise to a cascade, right? So you follow what happens with a cascade, and then you start running the Komodo model, and you ask, okay, did this create additional cascading events? And I'm not
Perfect.
sure about
Perfect.
this,
So
if I am
thanks.
understanding correctly. And then do you define the size of the avalanche by both the part that was BTW and the part plus the part from the Komodo?
So thank you. This is great clarification question. So what we do is we have a grain of sand that falls, and we let the cascade unfold. At the end of the cascade, any grain that has any node that has toppled gets its phase reset. So the phase reset happens at the very end of the cascading dynamics. And then we turn to Komodo, and we let Komodo run for some amount of time, delta t, enough for some synchronization to happen so that we reach sort of a steady state in Komodo. And then we go back to the BTW model, and some of the nodes have a lower, we lower their thresholds because they're out of phase with their neighbors. So we are looking at an infinite separation of timescales. Cascading dynamics happens. We count how many nodes toppled, and that's the size of the avalanche. We reset their phases, and then we turn to Komodo, and we let the system synchronize. And at the end of the delta capital T time period, we look at how synchronized you are with your neighbors, and we reset the thresholds of the nodes, and then we go back to the BTW layer. Perfect. Thank you for allowing that clarification. So we put this on 3 regular random graphs, and R of t is the Komodo order parameter, so how synchronized is the system between 0 and 1, and S of t is the total load on the system. And we see these emergent oscillations that have a time period that we wouldn't have predicted. And if I zoom in, so you can see that this is the load, the orange line is the load. So we go through a period of growing load, it rapidly decays, growth, decay, and this is the Komodo order parameter. So we're synchronized, we desynchronize, we synchronize, we desynchronize. This is a little bit of a close-up of the cascade shown over here, but it's much more illuminating if we plot the Komodo order parameter and the amount of load, the 2 order parameters for our system together. And what we see is that when the system is desynchronized, these numbers here are the fraction of time that the system spends in each phase. So we start from a desynchronized system, and we see that the system rapidly reaches synchronization, but it has very little load. And then it lives for 97% of the time in a regime where it's fully synchronized, and the amount of load is growing and growing until we reach a tipping point when I'll show you that a cascade causes a larger cascade, which causes an even larger cascade, which makes the whole system lose load and desynchronize. So for 97% of the time, we're in this wonderful regime where we have synchronization and very small cascades. And what is shown here is the degree, is the cascade size distribution. So in the 97% of the time, we have these very short-tailed cascade size distribution where we never see large events. At that tipping point, what I'm plotting here is the size of the current cascade and the size of the next cascade. So what we see is that when we reach the tipping point, a cascade ensues, and it causes an even larger cascade, which causes a larger cascade, which causes a larger cascade. And we see exponential growth in the size of the cascades. So we see essentially a cascade of cascades. And this is not the case in the BTW model. So if I plot size of current cascade versus size of next cascade, it's uncorrelated. So we see these exponential growth, and it's because of these endogenous seeds. So when I am in this regime of the tipping point, a cascade happens, and it causes so many of the toppled nodes to be out of phase with their neighbors that their threshold gets lowered, which causes a bigger cascade, which means more nodes are out of phase with their neighbors, which means that they're now endogenous seeds, which causes an even bigger cascade. So we see this exponential growth in cascading failures. And this turns me back to thinking about black swans and their counterparts. So here I've drawn a power law degree distribution. And as I mentioned, the tail events in power law degree distributions are often called black swans. So they follow the same distribution, they're just the rare events. Didier Sarnet, several years ago in 2009, introduced this notion of dragon kings, which are events that are as massive in size as black swans, but they happen with far more frequent probability. And the characteristic of these black swans is that they have a self-amplifying mechanism that is endogenous. So just like our cascade at the tipping point caused a larger cascade, which caused a larger cascade, these dragon kings are driven by self-amplifying mechanisms that kick in once you reach certain tipping points. And Sarnet has several examples of how these appear as bubbles in financial markets, sizes of cities, and failures in engineered systems. So they're far more likely than black swans and equally massive and destructive. And theory is still in its infancy, but these dragon kings have predictability, which makes that very nice. And we're actually able to do several analytic calculations using a branching process approximation. So we're able to calculate the location of that tipping point where we see that self-amplifying mechanism kick in and the cascade of cascades. We can calculate the frequency, the emergent frequency of this dragon king cycle, which had nothing to do with the Koromoto timescale or the cascading timescale. So it's an emergent timescale in our system. And then we can also analytically calculate the cascade size distribution in the buildup phase.
Sorry, I probably should have waited to the end, but I'm now really curious about that. So when you do the coupling, you are saying, okay, the change in capacity is going to be related to the amount of out of phase that they are. So there is another parameter in there. And I wonder, is that parameter controlling the kind of prevalence of these dragon?
So this is a great question. And it's also related to this continuous discrete world as well, because the thresholds in the BTW BTW model are discrete numbers, right? You can hold 3 grains of sand or 2 grains of sand, not 2.5. So we see that there are some abrupt steps, and where the coupling and the toppling thresholds are manifest more in the outcome of the frequency of the dragon king.
So this actually is making me think about climate change and these catastrophic events, right? Because you could imagine some of them as being sort of a result of kind of exogenous driving.
Yes.
But now we have moved to have amplifying factors. And so things that used to be, we call them 100-year floods, now are going to be a 2-year flood, because it is, I mean, am I kind of thinking of this in the right way?
So I think that there's really great connections to the place that we are right now with all of our systems getting close to tipping points. And I think Luis might have picked my brain, because I always say this, we have 100-year events happening every week in the world these days. And so definitely we are at a place, I believe that we're at a place where we are now seeing that endogenous effects are happening. So it used to be before that, a large storm happened, but the system was robust enough to absorb it. But now we've got storm after storm and coupling between, earthquakes and large volcanic eruptions and weather events as well. So I think we could make some analogies for climate change that hopefully we could get some data on as well. And we actually can also look at the thermodynamic limit of the system and the scaling. One thing I'm going to gloss over real quickly is that this is our classic idea of seeing self-organized criticality. So as I showed you, driving and dissipation balance the system at the critical point and give rise to power law degree distributions. So that's been the main idea, that SOC has power law degree distributions. But in all studies of SOCs, there's always been a mysterious bump at the tail. And in many of the studies, there's been a mysterious bump at the tail that can't be explained by finite size effects. And with Guga, we were able to show that we can actually, because of the discrete nature of the system, we can actually see dragon kings in SOC systems. So this is the energy of the system, the amount of sand that the system is holding. And this is the activity, the sizes of the cascades. And as you can see in the sand pile, I can throw sand down on grains that won't topple. So I'm increasing the energy of the system without causing any kind of toppling. So because of that discrete nature, I can drive the system well into the supercritical regime. And eventually a toppling will happen, and the system has so much energy stored up in it that it's going to end up causing a massive cascading failure. And these are the explanation for a lot of these bumps that have been observed in SOC systems and never explained before. So it's a trade-off between the amount of energy we're putting in at each time and the parameter epsilon, the dissipation rate. So it's a trade-off between these two, which shows us that we can actually have dragon kings in classic notions of self-organized criticality and lets us think about a taxonomy of dragon kings. But I want to turn in the last 10 minutes to think about how we're going to control networks with complex couplings and complex nodes. So what does control mean? So the classic notion of control is that we can start at any point in phase space, and we can drive a system to a final desired point in phase space in finite time. So we have some kind of action that we can enforce on the system that will drive it from any arbitrary initial state to the final desired state. And typically we use feedback control. So what does that mean? We have a system and we have sensors that estimate the state of the systems, y hat here. We feed that into a reference node, which knows what the ideal state should be. And that reference node tells a controller the difference between the ideal state and the current state. And that controller develops some actions that the actuator should take on the system. So this is the classic notion of feedback control. And classic control is not enough when we're thinking about these massive systems for several reasons. So we're thinking about systems with millions of degrees of freedom, genetic regulatory systems, social systems. So we probably don't have the ability to know the knowledge of every degree of freedom. So we can't use this notion of classic control. And full control may not be feasible. And a lot of these systems that we're interested in are self-organizing. And the upside of that, of course, is that it gives rise to distributed control strategies. But one of the downsides is that cascading failures are hallmarks of self-organized systems, as I've shown you already. And they have a lot of unanticipated response to control interventions. We understand a lot about the asymptotic steady state behavior of these far from equilibrium, of these driven self-organized systems, but we don't understand the approach to that asymptotic behavior. So before we dive into control, I think that it's good to take a step back and ask, what is it that we want to control? Do we actually want to control every single degree of freedom in the system? Do we want to control a macroscopic property, or do we want to control a microscopic property? So for instance, if we think about a disease spread, the macroscopic state is how many particular people are infected, how many people are infected. And the microscopic state is which particular individuals. So the Centers for Disease Control thinks about this a lot, like, who are we going to vaccinate? Do we want to make sure that the least number of people get the disease? Or do we want to make sure that the people who are most vulnerable to die from the disease don't get it? So macroscopic versus microscopic aspects. And then maybe we just want to steer the system towards a certain class of behaviors and avoid bad states. So the starting point is thinking about linear time invariant systems. So I can think about the state of the system at the next time step as a function of a linear evolution that is described by two components. So the A matrix is the connectivity of the network itself. So I've shown you a very simple dynamic network here with 4 nodes, and we can think about how the nodes can control one another. So we have an A matrix that describes the evolution of the network on its own. And then we have a B matrix, which is a network where control signals are injected into the system. So in this case, I'm injecting signals into the first node And the fourth node is shown by these blue lines here. So this is my control matrix where I'm going to be injecting signals. And our goal is to find the minimum number of nodes that we need to inject signals into in order to drive the system from any initial starting state to a specified end state. So control of linear time invariant systems is a beautiful realm of investigation where Kalman really illuminated a lot of this in the 1960s. So Kalman showed us that we can make a controllability matrix, which involves those A and B matrices on the last page, and it's structured like this. And if the rank of this controllability matrix is equal to the number of nodes, the system is fully controllable. And we can turn to something called the controllability Gramian. And so long as that A-B pair is controllable, that Gramian is non-singular, and we'll be able to solve for the minimum energy control signals to inject into the driver nodes in order to control the system. So Lin, 10 years later, said, let's relax Kalman's constraints. And instead of worrying about the exact weights of the nodes connected to each other, let's just worry about the non-zero entries. So we'll have zero entries and non-zero entries. And he was able to make tremendous progress on what's called structural control, just thinking about the non-zero entries and the controllability matrix. And this enabled a big breakthrough that happened in 2011, where Yang-Yu Liu, Laszlo Barabasi, and Jean-Jacques Slotin were able to bridge a gap and take these ideas of structural controllability and combine them with ideas from complex networks. So they were able to show that you could do a maximum matching using some techniques from spin glass theory. And the unmatched nodes, so you do a maximum matching on a specific instance of a network structure, and the unmatched nodes are our driver nodes that we need to control, and we can solve for the minimum number of driver nodes that we need. So this has led to a lot of very interesting work. They showed the degree distribution of real networks and a random rewiring. And as so long as the degree distribution is preserved, you need the same number of driver nodes. So the degree distribution determined the number of driver nodes. There's also been some great connections between structural controllability and phase transitions in networks where we see core percolation. And we see a regime where we have decentralized control being optimal and centralized control being optimal. It's also enabled us to look at classes of nodes and structural control and multi-layered systems. But when we go to real world systems, we're not going to be able to have this classic picture of linear time invariant because real world systems are not linear, they're nonlinear. And we have only partial knowledge, and we have self-organization as well. So all of these challenges stand in the way of using linear time invariant dynamics to understand real world systems. So we want to turn to nonlinear systems, and we can start from dynamical equations of motion, so the actual equations of the constituent elements. So we can have very arbitrarily complex dynamics, but it's inherently low dimensional. So here we can be inspired by the classic work of Ott, Grigobi, and York from Phys Rev Letters in 1989, where they looked at controlling chaos. So they looked at a system with 3 degrees of freedom. So we have the evolution equation for my variable x, which has 3 degrees of freedom. It evolves in time according to some function, which depends on the state of the system, and an external control parameter p. And this is the beautiful Lorentz attractor that's shown here. And the insight that they had is that an infinite number of unstable periodic orbits are typically embedded in a chaotic attractor. So what they did is they measured the system at normal intervals of time and found a way to stabilize the desired orbit by small changes to this parameter p. So really interesting work, but again, it only applies to low dimensional systems. This one has 3 degrees of freedom. And a lot of work from Adilson Motter and his group has really pushed on these ideas of using the nonlinear dynamics and basins of attraction to understand optimal control interventions. So for instance, we can think about a trajectory in one basin and giving it a small kick at a strategic moment in time that kicks it into the desired basin of space. And this is showing the state before the intervention and the admissible perturbations that we could do. in order to kick the system to the target basin where we want it to be. And there's several beautiful papers that came out of collaborations with Dilson's group. And we can also turn towards data-driven model discovery and control. So starting from the linear world, again, system identification has been a long held tradition in the world of control theory, where we do network inference. So we essentially discover effective equations of motion from time series data. So we can think about a dynamics that approximates the real dynamics from a linear system, linear perspective. We've extended those tools to think about nonlinear dynamics using operator theory. So things like Koopman operators, where we take a nonlinear system that is finite dimensional and we map it onto a linear system with infinite dimensions. So our trade-off is we go from a finite dimensional system that was nonlinear to an infinite dimensional system that is linear. And one of the beauties of this approach is that we can often identify key modes of interest in those operator theories and understand how to intervene on those key modes. So there's been a lot of recent work trying to think about how to control systems when we can use operator theory to describe their effective dynamics. There's also been a lot of recent work thinking about how we can do control on data-driven model discovery and using sparse low-dimensional representations of high-dimensional systems. And a lot of this work has come from Steve Brunton and Nathan Kutz's group, where they've developed a method called SINDI, sparse identification of nonlinear dynamics. So they start out with time series data of high-dimensional systems, and they do essentially like principal component analysis. So they project this high-dimensional space onto a sparse low-dimensional space, and then they map out the basins of attraction and the dynamical system structure of that sparse low-dimensional space. And so here's the original data, and they can identify basins of attraction and the trajectories and take advantage of small strategic kicks that kick the system from one basin to the desired basin. And Steve and Nathan wrote this very beautiful book, Data-Driven Science and Engineering, in 2019, which certainly I recommend for people interested in these ideas. My own work, I've worked a lot on control of phase transitions, which is something we would call parametric control. So I want to enhance or delay where a phase transition happens, but I'm not actually intervening on the system from that control perspective of driving nodes. So we're thinking more about how we can delay or enhance the onset of a phase transition in this parametric space. And I've also done a lot of work on control of self-organized criticality. And one of the interesting things that happens when we think about controlling SOC systems is that it comes down to a question of timescales. So when you control an SOC system, you can delay when a cascade happens, and you can delay and delay and delay that onset. But when a cascade finally happens, it's going to be massive in size. Or you can trigger cascades all the time. And if you're constantly triggering cascades, you're only going to get tiny cascades. So it becomes a question of what are you trying to optimize? So if you are constantly igniting cascades, you're always having damage in your system. If you suppress cascades for as long as you possibly can, you have no damage in your system, but eventually a cascade is going to happen and it's going to be massive in size and wipe out the whole system. So what is your timescale that you're trying to optimize over becomes an important question there. And then we can think about the ultimate challenge, which is trying to understand small interventions that we can do in human systems to try and entice humans to behave in ways that would be good for society. There's a lot of mathematical models of social behavior. So things like threshold models, voter models, opinion dynamics, work on game theory, where we analyze the extent of product adoption or epidemic spreading. But one of the fundamental questions that is unanswered is what mechanism makes an individual change their mind? We don't know. And there's competing mechanisms and competing hypotheses. So we have the classic competing hypotheses that people change their behaviors according to diminishing returns. So every one of my friends who adopts a new behavior influences me to adopt that behavior, each one of them a little bit less. And then I have these very nice functions that I can do analytic work with these submodular functions. But it might be critical mass that there's a sharp threshold that once a certain fraction of my neighbors adopt a behavior, then I immediately switch and adopt that behavior. And whether you have this submodular function or the sharp threshold function yields completely different theoretical results. So we don't even know the answer to this. Is it simple contagion or complex contagion? What actually makes people change their minds? And we have very different control interventions that we would have based on the different models and very different outcomes. So there's a lot of opportunities. I would love to see more ideas of feedback put into models from statistical physics and more statistical treatments in control theory. So thinking more about mesoscopic levels of control instead of controlling every degree of freedom. So as I said, we can increase network complexity and think about hypergraphs or multiplex networks. In statistical physics, we have a lot of far from equilibrium models that we study. So self-organized criticality, things like asymmetric exclusion principles, where we can think about using some kind of feedback in the system to control the driving rate. And a lot of ideas for machine learning and AI and data-driven model discovery, hybrid treatments where parts of the system are continuous, parts are discrete. And one challenge would be to identify a key set of paradigms or problems that as a community we can use as case studies to validate different approaches for different scenarios. So I invite you to look at our review article where we go much more in depth about what I was just showing you on the last page of opportunities for bridging control theory, nonlinear dynamics, and statistical physics. And I'll just conclude by saying that modern systems are made of these interconnected complex systems. They're socio-technical, cyber-physical, eco-social. They have these feedback loops that feed upon each other, causing endogenous behaviors that we wouldn't have expected. And we can't necessarily reduce it to a set of interconnected differential equations, which is what my social scientist friends always tell me, that we're trying to mathematize humans and that maybe this just is not possible. So emergent interactions that we see when we allow the node dynamics to be nonlinear and the network structures to be non-trivial. So we see these decoupled states, and I showed you how bringing the oscillatory dynamics into classic models of cascading failures gives rise to new emergent behaviors like these dragon kings of self-amplifying cascades with an emergent timescale that we wouldn't have predicted. And control of complex networks, thinking about structural controllability, which is the linear time invariant world, which is a great insight, but certainly doesn't apply to things when nodes have nonlinear dynamics. And we can think about their basin structures, but again, we're stuck to low dimensional systems and not the high dimensional systems that we're interested in. We can use data-driven models to simplify, to sparsify those high dimensional systems and think about small control interventions. And then we can think about things like control of phase transitions and self-organized criticality. And I'm just gonna end by putting up a slide to thank all the people who have contributed to this work. And thank you all for your attention and your questions as well.
Very much, Raissa. So I think we have time for a couple questions. Yep.
So I actually have two questions, but the first question is, when you talk about extreme events on networks in particular, can you classify them as abrupt transitions? Because in my mind, it's like a nonlinear system. I'm visualizing the network as a system, which goes to a particular rare state, metastable state, and then comes back because there are fluctuations around. So would that be classified as an abrupt transition or not? And the second question is related to the last part when you said small interventions, but you said it's not related to the control. Is that, did I get that right? Like, what are the small interventions if they are not control?
Great, so this two-part question. So the first one was looking at extreme events and abrupt transitions. And they are connected with each other, but they can also be complementary because we can see very extreme events happening in systems with smooth transitions. And there's been beautiful work on early warning signs when you have extreme events in systems that have second order phase transitions. And we can use these ideas that At the critical point, we see power law distributions and response functions as indicators of early warning signs and critical slowing down. So we have advanced early warning signs and indicators. When we have abrupt transitions, we don't have all of the associated phenomena of second order phase transitions. So we don't have power law response functions, and it makes detecting that we're reaching the tipping point much more challenging. So when we have these Dragon King-like self-amplifying behaviors, they are not accompanied by early warning signs. And once they start, they really kick off a massive chain of events that follows. And the second idea was interventions. And what I definitely meant that small interventions are what we want in order to control systems. So we want to say control some macroscopic aspect of the system. And we're looking for that smallest little way that we can intervene with a microscopic degree of freedom to drive the macroscopic behavior to what we want.
Thank you so much for this nice overview. I have a question about nonlinear dynamics. It's true that the node dynamics matters, and we have been paying a lot of attention to that. But there is also another aspect here that is the nature of the interactions. They are often nonlinear. So there is nonlinearity in the coupling.
Yes.
And I would like to have your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so this is a great question. So I've been telling you about making the nodes have nonlinear dynamics. And Adilson was saying the edges can have nonlinear dynamics. And that is definitely a forefront area. And I was talking with a couple of people this morning about physical implementations of machine learning. So there's some people working on circuits that can be trained to be classifiers. And that takes advantage of the nonlinearity of the edges. And it's a really great question because even if we think about simple nodes and simple edges, we know that networks can have different robustness properties based on whether we're removing edges, we're removing nodes. And linear control theory has very different properties if we're using the edges to control things or we're using the nodes to control things as well. So there is a much broader space that my simplistic picture, I need a third axis, which is the edge nonlinearity, which I have not yet gotten to, but I think that's a really good caveat because oftentimes we find that if control is on edges, the complete different properties that make it robust for nodal control are what's at play when we're doing edge control. So I think that's a really good thing that we should start thinking about as well. And having data is wonderful. So systems where we could get experimental data and try and play out some of these theoretical ideas would be really useful.
Last question, and we are over time already.
Question then. So you mentioned the feedback control versus parametric control. And one of the main advantages of feedback control is that it's robust to modeling uncertainties. How does the parametric control faces the challenges of model uncertainties and parametric uncertainties?
So this is a great question. So, when you have feedback, you can be very robust because you're constantly monitoring your state and adapting what the control interactions are. When you do things like parametric control, you set a parameter and the system settles down to its steady state behavior. And maybe you change the parameter and it resettles down. So there's none of this ability to instantaneously correct. And so this is a really great question. And when I talk to my control theory friends, this is their problem with thinking about nonlinear dynamics. So thinking about basin control, control of chaos from Ott, Grigobi, York. So they say it's not robust to fluctuations in external environmental situations. And so having that feedback is really essential for having real-time interventions instead of having to let the system run and settle down and then change things and settle down. So certainly having robustness, having that instantaneous response from feedback really gives a lot of robustness to the system.
I'll thank Raissa again.
Thank you.
It's an excellent talk. I'll save my questions for her for afterwards.